Stephen and I may actually be in agreement on this. He may see that limits are a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused.
Cameron Bertuzzi claims that if a first cause exists, then a God must exist. To defend this idea, he puts forward a so-called proposal that limits must be the relevant difference between things that are caused and things that aren't. This proposal is the foundation of his argument from limits, and he says that he really wants us to give it some thought. So I did, and let me tell you, I'm not so sure that the same could be said for Mr. Capturing Christianity. In this video, I'll focus on one of Cameron's argument's fatal flaws. My name is Tal, and this is Due Diligence. In a months-long YouTube debate with Stephen Woodford, aka Rationality Rules, Cameron Bertuzzi has presented and attempted to defend his version of the Kalam cosmological argument. Stephen has done a very good job tackling a lot of what Cameron put out, but there is one part which I feel hasn't been crushed quite finely enough, and that is Cameron's argument from limits, which he uses to get from a first cause to God. If you've watched my videos in the past, you probably know that I find cosmological arguments very unconvincing. I think that they all suffer from the same critical problem of trying to use intuition to reach conclusions regarding things that are completely unlike anything in our experience, and thus completely removed from anything that informed our intuition. If you've watched my videos, you also know that because of that, I really don't love it when fellow atheists criticize these arguments on the basis of them not getting us to a specific God. It's true that they don't, but they aren't meant to. They're meant to provide a stepping stone, a first premise on the road to a specific God. And this is why focusing on that part is less than productive, I think. Far more important is that because of this critical problem, they don't provide that stepping stone. They don't actually have what it takes to establish a first cause, an unmoved mover, a necessary being, whatever. Here, however, I actually do want to focus on the part of Cameron's Kalam that tries to get from a first cause to a God. Not because his arguments for the first cause itself are so convincing, more like because in that part of his argument he doesn't actually present anything new, whereas his argument from limits, meant to get us from that first cause to God, is, to me at least, actually a new argument, or at least a new way of presenting this line of thinking, and even more so because Cameron actually mentions the point that undermines his whole case for this argument, and he doesn't even seem to notice.
The second premise says that if there is a first cause, then God exists. My primary argument in support of my second premise focuses our attention on the difference between the caused and the uncaused. My proposal is that the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits. Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited in various ways. In general, limits have causes.
So, Cameron says that the first cause, if it exists, must be unlimited. And that, according to him, points to God.
As a truly, thoroughly unlimited thing, it would have no limits in shape, no limits in size, no limit in power, in knowledge, in goodness, or in value. In other words, an unlimited nature points to a perfect nature, a nature that is supreme, a nature that cannot be improved upon. So in other words, an unlimited nature points to God.
Now, as per usual, there is a ton that I can say about it. Steve said some of it, but he also needs to respond to Cameron's other arguments, so he couldn't really cover all that there is to cover. If you'd like to see a more thorough response to Cameron's argument from limits, leave a comment down below, and if there is enough of a demand for it, I'll gladly make another longer video. For now though, I want to make this one relatively short, so I'll just focus on one hole in Cameron's argument from limits. That his support for his claim that the relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused is limits, even if it were convincing, actually points to a critically different difference. This idea of limits as the relevant difference seems to be based entirely on the intuition that the uncaused would probably be unlimited in time. Since everything we know about causation is tied up with time, I'd agree that intuitively it makes sense that if something is uncaused, it's probably not limited in this way. However, as I keep saying, it's really weird to me that people try to intuit about things that are so far from anything we've ever experienced. Be it the uncaused, or timeless existence, or even limitless things, I just don't get why Cameron or anyone feels that their intuition is of any use for these cases. I know that mine isn't. At most, we can use our intuition to hypothesize about these questions, but definitely not to reach any conclusions. But putting that aside, even if our intuitions are somehow useful here, I can't see how Cameron lands on the idea that the first cause must be unlimited in every way. I'm kidding, of course. There's no mystery to how he gets there. He starts with his conclusion and works his way back. He then identifies this intuition that something uncaused shouldn't be limited in time and bridges the gap to somehow make it sound like he's saying something profound. But really, if we review everything that he says to substantiate this claim of his, there's nothing there more than just this intuition. He brings up intuition as one of two arguments in support of this claim, the other being very flawed application of inductive generalization.
The second argument embedded in this clip appeals to a widely shared rational intuition about the nature of limits. It kind of just seems obvious that limits have causes. My limited computer has a cause for its existence. My limited desk has a cause for its existence. Limits seem to be the kind of thing that have causes. Notice, however, that this intuition kind of weakens when we consider things that don't have limits.
Kind of just seems obvious that limits have causes. Sure, this might be a widely shared rational intuition, but even if it's true that limits have causes, that doesn't mean that limited things have causes. And it definitely doesn't mean that uncaused things have no limits of any kind. I'm actually not even sure that anyone, Cameron included, would intuitively think that this is the case. I may be wrong here, but I think that if it weren't an attempt to prove God, no one would actually give this answer. It's a matter of what the question being asked is. If the question was something like, what might be a relevant difference? I really don't think anyone would come up with the idea of limits. However, if the question is more like what might be a relevant difference that can be used to prove the existence of God, then I can see how they'd creatively think of this idea. Cameron wants to show us that one doesn't need to believe in God to share this intuition.
Some atheists will say that an eternal universe doesn't need a cause. An eternal universe has no limit in time. It never began to exist. Removing a limit, in this case, removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit.
Removing a limit removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit. Again, sure, but it does nothing to the need for a causal explanation of the thing itself. Removing anything from existence removes the need to explain that thing. If that thing is a limit, like if we remove a limit, then the limit doesn't exist, so we don't need to explain it. Duh. Of course, you don't need a causal explanation for the universe having a limit if you don't think that the limit actually exists. That still doesn't mean that you don't need to explain the existence of the universe. When you remove a limit, it only removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit, just like when you remove anything else. And you know what? While you don't need to explain the existence of anything that doesn't exist, you might need to explain its non-existence. It's a matter of whether or not you'd expect that thing to exist. For example, if you remove my third nipple, conceptually, not surgically, like if you don't think that I have a third nipple, which, by the way, I actually don't, then you don't need a causal explanation for my third nipple. However, if you remove, again, conceptually, my left nipple, that is, if you think that I don't have a left nipple, then while you don't need to explain the existence of that nipple, you actually do need to explain its non-existence. You need to provide an explanation for why you don't think that I have one, because the expected null hypothesis would be that I do. And in either case, it doesn't affect the need to have a causal explanation for my existence. Even if you remove all limits, it just means that there are no limits that require a causal explanation. But the limitless thing itself, as well as its limitlessness, still kinda does. And worse yet, even if removing the limit in time does remove the need for a causal explanation for the thing itself, even if an eternal universe really doesn't need a cause for its existence, which I already admitted does feel somewhat intuitive, even if not very well substantiated, it still doesn't follow that removing a limit removes the need for a causal explanation. It's not a limit, it's a specific limit. If we accept this intuition as true, that still only means that the uncaused is without limit in time, not without limits altogether. When Cameron tries to demonstrate how universal this intuition is, all he keeps getting to is the unlimited in time property. He doesn't give any example of other limits which, when removed, also remove the need to explain the thing itself. Now, of course, a perfect being, as per Cameron's definition, has no limits, and that includes any limits in time. So, if that intuition of ours is tethered to reality, then a perfect being would require no causal explanation by virtue of it not having limits in time. But even if that intuition is totally correct, even if anything uncaused is limitless in time, and even if anything that's limitless in time is also uncaused, it still doesn't follow that anything that requires no causal explanation, or that is limitless in time, is also limitless in every other respect. Something could be without limits in time, but still have other limits, and thus an uncaused thing isn't necessarily a perfect being. To illustrate, let's substitute the idea of limits with human connections. Limits in time with a specific human connection, that of being married. Uncaused things with bachelors, and perfect beings with people who are completely alone. A person that has no human connection of any kind is completely alone. A bachelor is not married. Being married is a type of human connection, so obviously if someone is completely alone, they are also not married. If someone is completely alone, they are definitely a bachelor. But that doesn't mean that anyone who's a bachelor is also completely alone, does it? They could have other human connections. Now, a being that has no limits of any kind is perfect. An uncaused thing has no limits in time. Limits in time are a type of limit, so obviously if a being is perfect, it's definitely not limited in time. If a being is perfect, it's definitely uncaused. But that doesn't mean that anything that's uncaused is also perfect, does it? It could still have other limits. Cameron even points that out himself.
Now, for the record, I don't think that an eternal universe, just in virtue of being eternal, is completely unlimited. It still would seem to have limits in value and in power and maybe even in size and some other different areas. But the point is that a lot of atheists seem to recognize that limits are a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused.
Get it? Even atheists think that an eternal universe, a universe with no limit in time, might be uncaused. Also, an eternal universe isn't completely unlimited. It might be limited in other ways. So, even atheists recognize that uncaused things are probably completely unlimited, huh? Cameron wants us to really think about his proposal that uncaused things would have no limits.
Second, I offered limits as a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused, and this is really important, as a proposal. I wanted Stephen and everybody watching to really think hard about the problem for yourself. Think about it for yourself. What is a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused? Seriously, I want you to pause this video right now, think about it, and then write in the comments what you come up with.
He really wants us to think about it, but he doesn't seem to do the same with the other proposal that he claims that many atheists believe, that uncaused things would have no limit, just in time. He doesn't even seem to notice that it constitutes another proposal. He tells us that
thus far in this debate, it seems like limits is like the only viable candidate on offer.
And to support the viability of his candidate, he points to another candidate that's no less viable than his. So there is another candidate, but more than that, the case that he makes for his so-called only viable candidate is actually more of a case for that other candidate. And since he doesn't acknowledge this other candidate, he doesn't even attempt to show that his candidate is better, to discuss other limits and show why they must also not exist in an uncaused thing, to give us any reason to think that being without limit in time isn't enough. Even if his whole case here is completely convincing, and to me it isn't, not even remotely, it would still only get us to uncaused things being unlimited in time and nothing more. Definitely not to them being perfect. Cameron is the one who put this proposal on the table, but his rhetoric does a pretty good job at hiding that fact, perhaps even from himself.
We've come full circle to the original point that I wanted us all to think about. What is a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused? Thus far in this debate, it seems like limits is like the only viable candidate on offer. And in fact, super interesting, in his most recent response, Stephen may actually agree with me. Is Stephen's grand theory of the universe? Get this, it has no limit in time.
So in my model, the grand universe, whether it consists of a multiverse or whatever, is uncaused. It's existed forever.
If the universe has existed forever, then it has no limit in time. But if that's right, Stephen and I may actually be in agreement on this. He may see that limits are a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused.
It's easy to criticize Cameron's kalam from many different angles. His argument from limits, which he heavily relies on to get us from a first cause to a god, is virtually limitless in the amount of holes that one can poke in it. Yet, it is not uncaused. Indeed, it is very easy to spot the cause for this bad argument, and here it is. This argument is not an attempt to find out if a first cause does lead to a god. It's an attempt to prove that it does, no matter the intellectual cost. As always, I eagerly await reading your thoughts on this. I welcome any challenges and corrections to what I said here. If you like this video, I'd really be grateful if you share it, like it, subscribe to my channel if you aren't subscribed yet, all that good stuff. And meanwhile, remember, things are complex, but they don't have to be complicated. Have a good one.